Diversity is the death of fantasy, for the incredibly simple reason that it is not fantastical. In fact, nothing could be further from fantastical. For whilst fantasy is a term that is at once incredibly broad and can contain practically anything from dragons to talking dresses, it is also a very specific thing. Regardless of what a person thinks of when you say the word fantasy, be it Lord of the Rings, Discworld, Warhammer, or the Chronicles of Narnia, they all have one thing in common. They are not our world. They are not our humdrum everyday lives. They are not our everyday experiences. They are fantastical settings. And this is what makes a good fantasy world so incredibly captivating. The sense of adventure around every corner, as fresh and alien wonders are revealed one by one, with a sense of an enormous, ever-widening and deepening world filled with mysteries behind it all. This is why Tolkien's work is such a masterpiece. You start in a humble hamlet, where the most magical thing is a slightly bumbling wizard and his fireworks. Then, slowly, a creeping danger. Darkness and shadow seeps into the story until the fate of the entire world is at stake. And it is a world we now know, a world of countless miracles built upon an incredible foundation of myths and lore, hinted at through the telling of the tale. For Tolkien constructed an entire universe with gods, angels, demons and wizards, with orcs and elves and men of all persuasions, and a history stretching over thousands of years. It is, by all accounts, an incredibly robust and well thought out setting, but ironically, this also makes it an incredibly fragile setting, where the slightest bit of outside influence can bring it all crashing down. This is due to something we all know by now, the idea of the suspension of disbelief. The unspoken contract entered into by the viewer/reader and the author/filmmaker, where the creator promises to craft for us a world filled with amazing stuff, and in return we won't ask too many questions like, how is the 200 tons dragon flying using nothing but a pair of flimsy membraned wings? And generally speaking, the vast majority of the audience is more than happy to sign that contract, because we are here to be entertained. But it cuts both ways. Once you have established a thing and we have accepted it, then that is now law, and you must not deviate from it. For example, in Star Wars, lasers make sound in space, and so suddenly having lasers not make sound in space would be incredibly jarring. And this is a full-on blanket statement. It matters for any and all changes in violation of the established world, because the world is what we have embraced and accepted. Now, of course, there are always degrees of violation, the elves coming to Rohan's aid before the siege of Helm's Deep, for example. Or Elrond taking Isildur to Mount Doom, where Isildur refuses to throw the One Ring into the fire. Or the death of Sauron and the entire skipping of the Scouring of the Shire. But if you look into all of the differences between the trilogy movies and the books, and there are many differences, very few of them, if any, actually changes the world itself. Now, there are character differences here and there. Aragorn is far clearer on his ambition in the book, and Frodo is much braver. Some characters are also left out entirely, or given larger or smaller roles. But at the end of the day, everything ends up as it should, in a world that looks and feels like the books intended. And these little changes work and will continue to work in book-to-movie adaptations, because we tend to be far more sensitive to world changes than to story changes, up until a certain point, of course. Because the world can exist without the story, but the story cannot exist without the world. Which finally leads us to the point that diversity is the death of fantasy, because it is fundamentally opposed to fantasy. As we talked about previously, fantasy is a very broad term, and yet its meaning in each specific case is also very clear-cut, well-documented, and outlined. Often with many books written about its nature, its style, design, and the nature of its inhabitants as well. These are, as I mentioned earlier, the laws of the universe. Whereas diversity, the modern-day political term, is by definition about enforcing an ideological worldview above any and all other concerns, regardless of the creative cost to the original work. Sir Lenny Henry has been the perfect example of this as the Black Hobbit. He has talked a lot about diversity in the Rings of Power, but he has yet to say a single, solitary, correct thing about the actual Lord of the Rings, a property he claims to love. In Lenny's world, the hobbits are a nomadic, travelling tribe, which travel with the fertility of the crops. And the Harfoots are not even hobbits at all, but a multicultural tribe, not a species of black and brown Maoris, and Asian hobbits as well, obviously. Lenny's at best disinterest and at worst active disgust of Tolkien's work is well documented at this point, as is his love for arguing that himself and those who look like him should be privileged by, for example, tax breaks on hiring people of the correct skin color. But Lenny isn't even really to blame here. He is just another NPC who has seen a way of gaining personal benefit via the prevailing race grift ideology, as he is doing nothing more than repeating the same pre-programmed talking points of many other NPCs. Let me demonstrate with another couple of them, and I do apologize in advance for the 1 minute and 40 seconds of pain you are about to endure.
I want to start by saying these are not real, okay? The new Lord of the Rings series, The Rings of Power, and Game of Thrones prequel, House of the Dragon, are both massive hits, but they don't exist in the real world, okay? There are no dragons, there are no hobbits, you know that. And there are critics who are saying they were too woke by adding diverse characters. Are you telling me black people can't be fake people too? Yeah. Is that what you're telling me?
You can be a dragon. Well,
I don't know if there's like a Hobbit, club. I don't know if they're going to be protests, but people. What is wrong with y'all?
Well, their argument is that it betrays the source material. Like
they haven't read the source material.
Of course they haven't. Like J.K. Tolkien and stuff like that. But I'm a fantasy.
Hamilton then.
Well, yes, but I'm a fantasy nerd, and Whoopi and I are sci-fi and fantasy nerds, so I love it so much. And I especially love Mr. Toussaint, who plays the very sexy black man,
yes,
the rich
you have the
man
picture
with dreads.
of the man who is looking much like me.
I love him.
I think
He looks like you when you had the white dress.
Yes, okay, Mr. Toussaint.
I love Mr. Toussaint. I would like him to be a guest on the show. But that being said, what I think is fascinating is, like, dragons are okay, fire-breathing dragons, and people with white hair that are born like that when they're little, and violet eyes, but the black people in it is just a bridge too far for these.
That's what he said. Wait.
Quote, these are not real. Quote, adding diverse characters. Quote, dragons are okay, but not black people? And by far the most telling of them all, they haven't read the source material by J.K. Tolkien. Says the self-proclaimed fantasy nerd. These people are as fake as Whoopi's last name. No quibble, no question. The only reason they care, and I use that word in its loosest possible definition, about Lord of the Rings is because it is a thing. A popular thing, or at least it was, before they started trying to ruin it. They are in it purely for the power and privilege that loving it may confer. And they make that excruciatingly obvious. Whoopi starts with the NPC line, it's not real, and therefore it doesn't matter. This is a fan here saying this because, well, to most fans, the thing they love really isn't all that important, you see. God damn it. And, of course, because this isn't real human history, it's worthless. Again, a very common fan point of view. And then continues to say that anyone critiquing the rape of the lore haven't read it. You know, again, the lore by J.K. Tolkien. As I have said on many occasions now, these peoples have a greater good, an agenda that surpasses the supposed love they have for a setting. And this is why diversity is, without exception, the death of fantasy. For when we see Lenny Henry on screen as a black hobbit, we know why he is there. He was not the best man for the job, nor was he chosen because he looks like a half-foot, but because to him and his like, this is a politically necessary job to, as he himself puts it, take up space in Tolkien's world. He is an invading force, a parasite, and he is utterly aware, as again, he himself claims. And in turn, well, there is no space left for the magic of Middle-earth. The elves look like random dudes from California. The court of Numenor is ruled by a black queen, as every ethnicity in our world is represented, yet not a single Numenorian is present. It is all a constant visual reminder that you are not in a fantasy world. The suspension of disbelief is broken again and again as all you see are regular-ass people in second-tier costumes. There are no long-haired, elegant elves here, just a Puerto Rican dude who likes his hair short and wouldn't want to grow it out for a silly little TV show. It's only Rings of Power, after all. It's only the Lord of the Rings, you know, some second-tier entity. There are no high men of Numenor either, just Baldry from Seri here. And above it all, you are constantly reminded that this was made by creators who puts the skin color of their actors well above any notion of love to J.R.R. Tolkien's work and world. And even beyond the work of Tolkien, this idea, this approach of diversity above everything is an insult to the entirety of the fantasy genre, because race should not matter in a fantasy world at all. My favorite quote on this comes from Terry Pratchett's Discworld series. Quote, "Racism was not a problem on the Discworld because, what with trolls and dwarves and so on, speciesism was far more interesting. Black and white lived in perfect harmony and ganged up on green." End quote. And that is the perfect attitude to take towards a fantasy setting. Our ideas of racism simply doesn't matter in a world with elves and orcs and trolls and dwarves and gods and angels. Peter Jackson understood this when he made the Lord of the Rings movies. The showrunners of the Rings of Power do not. And so, allow me to illuminate them by giving you this little snippet from an old interview explaining precisely why the Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and The Return of the King will forever be classics, whilst The Rings of Power will be forgotten within a month of its last episode's airing.
Well, we didn't want to put any of our own, certainly in terms of the thematic material, we didn't want to put any of our own baggage. I mean, we had no interest in putting our messages into this movie, but we thought that we should honour Tolkien by putting his messages into it. And we thought he cared about things. The countryside and the rise of evil, and he cared passionately about certain issues. And we thought what we should do to honour him is to make sure that what he cared about ends up in the movie. That's what we tried to do.